I'm joined by the Grammy Award-winning composer Richard Danielpour, who is certainly one of the most performed and recorded composers of his generation. You're here to talk about your opera, the Grand Hotel Tartarus, which brings up connotations of the underworld with that kind of name. We'll talk about that in a minute. And also about your new album that's coming out in June on Naxos Records. These are songs in three languages, so three different sets of music that we're going to talk about. But first of all, I know the time will have been past for people who are watching this, but you have a performance tonight, right, of your opera?
I do. It's the last of four, in fact, and it is the premiere run of an opera that took me nearly 4 years to compose.
Wow.
And it's the longest I have ever taken to work on anything, including my first opera, Margaret Garner, which took about 33 months, The Passion of Yeshua, which is a dramatic oratorio that could be staged, which took me about 2 years, and now this. But in this case, this is the first opera in which I actually wrote my own libretto. And I
Wow.
wrote the libretto during the lockdown, the first phase of the lockdown in 2020, when I was forced by my doctor, because of my asthma, as a high risk person, to stay inside. So it was literally like a house arrest for me, because I went out maybe only to visit my pulmonologist a few times during that period, maybe a couple of times to go buy something that was of utter importance. But it was an extraordinary experience doing that, because I wrote almost all of the libretto between the hours of 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. And it had happened after my one and only, and it will be my one and only trip to Las Vegas, in which I had a residency at the University of Las Vegas, Nevada. And I stayed in one of those very, very chic, upscale 5-star hotels. And being allergic to cigarette smoke, I was in the no smoking wing, which of course reeked of cigarette smoke. Everything that could have gone wrong during my 3 days there did. And then to top it all off, I came back in the third week of February 2020 with a horrible case of influenza A, in which I was hallucinating from very, very high fever. And in the midst of the hallucinations and maybe dreams or whatever, a mixture of the two, I started seeing the dramatic scenario for this opera.
So tell us about the dramatic scenario. The title, leaves all kinds of possibilities in your mind. I wonder if you can tell us about that.
Well, in this particular opera, it's a dark comedy, actually, with a tender ending. It's in 2 acts with an intermission. Total playing time is about 110 minutes. And it begins with 6 guests entering this very chic, opulent, almost overly opulent hotel lobby
In
in
Las Vegas?
in a place that could be very much like Las Vegas.
Yeah.
Uh, and all of these 6 guests are a little puzzled how they got there. They're not quite sure how they arrived. And each one of these people has done something absolutely terrible in their lives. And they're greeted by 3 bellmen and 3 guest services women who they sing all at the same time as if they only had one brain. And eventually they're greeted by the hotel manager, who's an extremely elegant, well-educated man, as Mick Jagger would have referred to him, a man of wealth and taste. And all of these guests, they're waiting for their rooms to be ready, and there's a sumptuous dinner prepared for them. And by the end of the evening, some of them want to go home, but the doctor, who this is a doctor who is, in a way, doesn't feel she belongs there, and has actually killed her husband. She realizes something's not right with the place, And when a couple of the guests, a daughter of a mafia boss and a hotel tycoon, rich self-made woman, when they decide they want to go home, Mr. Lucien, the hotel manager, tells them that they can't go home. And the reason why they can't go home, as Dr. Veronica Vera figures out, is that they're all dead and that they're in their own version of hell. And Mr. Lucien, as they discover, is actually the devil. And he's not a wild beast with horns. He's really an enabler. And he explains to them that they will never be held against their will, but they have to decide whether they can stay or whether they want to leave. But he says to them, you know, why not stay here with me? You have everything you need and everything is free. And he explains that all they do up there is sing and dance and laugh and pray and sing and dance a little more. And after a while, it's such a bore. The whole thing is in rhyme until the very end of the opera. And then finally, one of the characters, the doctor, realizes that, you know, and you find out in the beginning of the second act how they all died. And Dr. Vera killed her husband because she found him abusing their 13-year-old daughter. And then she drove away and threw the gun over the San Francisco Bay and jumped in after it and drowned herself. But at the very end of the opera, she realizes, as even though she doesn't deserve to be in heaven, she also doesn't feel she belongs in the hotel hell. And she prays to God for forgiveness. And in the moment that she's finally able to forgive herself, she starts to hear the sound of heaven in the form of an offstage chorus, which welcomes her, and she follows the sound. She follows the heavenly sound, and that's how the opera ends.
It's kind of like the Twilight Zone meets Faust. I hear that in what you're saying.
There's a lot, there are actually a lot of many different operas in this work, which is sort of the case with a lot of 20th and 21st century operas. Opera is a kind of palimpsest that is each, you know, so many operas I see in the 20th century and 21st century have layers of other operas hidden inside them. It's a natural thing.
Yeah.
For us at this time in history and in music history to be doing this. And it's very natural. It's not a contrived thing for me any more than it was for my dear friend and colleague, John Quiliano, who we just had dinner with last night. He, you know, if you look at The Ghost of Versailles, or you're looking at the Lord of Cries, there is a kind of relationship to other works of the past and also to history.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder if you could put on your instructor hat for a moment and talk a little bit about the cast and working with the singers. And I'm curious, like, what kind of pedigree do singers come away with from you're teaching at UCLA at the Herb Alpert School of Music? What kind of pedigree do they come with when it comes to modern music, when it comes to new works like this?
Well, you know, I should answer the first question first. You've
Okay.
asked me two, so in all fairness, let me answer the first one.
I promise I have more questions, but
I
we'll start with
love
this.
your questions. You're asking wonderful questions, and I have to say that one of the things that made me want to do this at UCLA is not just the fact that I'm here as a distinguished professor of music at UCLA's Herb Alpert School of Music. It's also because I wanted the opportunity to collaborate on a work with the great director and former Met Opera star Peter Cazares, who is actually in his last year. He's retiring from UCLA at the end of this academic year. And in fact, this evening, May 23rd, we are actually celebrating his 17-year tenure with a special party honoring him before the show tonight.
Well, I know Peter from the Metropolitan Opera quiz. We did the radio quiz together a few times.
There you go. And he's such a brilliant man. And he was not only my dramaturg, but he was my consigliere for this opera. He was he's the main reason I wanted to do it at UCLA. But our thought was that we would we would do a show that would be involve a combination of professionals and students. So students would learn how to work with professionals, and some of the professionals that we hired, it's about half and half. Some of the pros that we hired would also be there in a kind of mentoring capacity, but also as a way of sort of showing where the bar is. And it's a great idea. It happens at the Marlborough Music Festival, the same philosophy is there. And one of the things we also thought was that because I was given the 3-year appointment of something called the Covell Chair, which allowed me to have all of the expenses, including about $75,000 of copying, proofreading, and printing costs. Getting an opera on paper is not a cheap thing. And one of the things we're doing as a result of my Covell Chair is making a professional quality video, which I think we will have based on Tuesday night's performance, which we will then be able to share with major opera companies in the United States and in Europe. I wrote this piece not only because it was a labor of love personally and because I really loved the whole idea as it was evolving, but I wrote it also so that it was economically feasible. It's a one-set opera that takes place in the Aristotelian 24-hour cycle, and it's an ensemble piece, but it also has two leading roles, really, and it has not a gigantic chorus the way Margaret Garner did. It's more manageable in a sense.
Well, we look forward to maybe seeing that and hearing that in the future, definitely. Let's talk about this new recording that's coming out from Naxos. It's coming out in June, and it's somewhat related to the opera in that it's vocal music. You're teaming up once again with soprano Hilla Plitman, and you've got these 3 different languages, 3 different song settings. Maybe you can talk about the overview of what's included on this recording.
Absolutely. This was for me a recording that I've actually wanted to make for some time now, but we finally had the pieces of the puzzle in place to make just the kind of recording I wanted to with Hilla. I have known her for 13 years. She's more than a colleague. She's almost like a sister, just a dear friend. I thought that because she's so amazing as an artist, not just as a singer and not just as a singer in dramatic roles, but in concert situations, but she's really wonderful with languages. And I wrote a piece for her called Songs of Love and Loss, which is in Persian, which is the language of my own ancestors. Both my mother and father were born in Iran. And she learned the language in a way that was stunning. Her pronunciation, one of my former students, Shahab Paranj, who is Iranian, coached her a bit. And he said to me after about an hour of working with her, it's as if she's been living in Tehran for the last few years.
Yeah.
So there was that. And then I also wrote a piece that was commissioned by the Curtis Institute, where I've been teaching for 28 years. And also it was also commissioned by Ken Lipper, who is a mutual friend. Ken and I are mutual friends of Nicola Bulgari, who was having his 80th birthday a few years ago. And we wrote that, for his 80th birthday. And it's in Italian, and the texts are texts that are attributed to Antonio Vivaldi, which he apparently composed all of these sonnets, as they are, to accompany his famous Four Seasons Concerti Grossi. And that was something I wanted to do because I've had a love affair with Italy for the past, 40 years now. And in fact, I'm in the process of shopping for a place that might be more than just a summer rental. So, you know, there's all kinds of things. I mean, there's um
Well, it's a great idea to set those sonnets to music by Vivaldi. I can't believe that nobody has thought of that before. That was a
me too,
brilliant idea.
and they're gorgeous, and they're 12 movements with cello, piano, and voice. The cellist on this recording passed away in January. It's very suddenly and shockingly. A dear friend of mine who was on the cello faculty at UCLA, Antonio Lisi, and he retired. He retired in December. He had just bought a house with his family in Florence, and he was very happy. And they discovered he had glioblastoma in early January, and it was so sad, so tragic. But he is on the recording and playing with Hila and with Ina Felix. And then the third piece is something that was written also for Hila, which are songs to texts that my father wrote. He was a poet when he was alive, and he wrote these texts as in essence as love poems to my mother when he was actually in Iran and she was in the US, and he was sort of stuck there dealing with some business issues with his family. So I'd always wanted to set something of my dad's, you know, but never had the opportunity. And this is for harp, viola, and voice, much more intimate setting than all the others. And there are 3 songs. But I thought that having songs in 3 languages is also reflective of not only what Hila can do, but of also that they're also, each of them represent an important part of my life.
I'm interested in the orchestration for the songs of your father, with harp and viola. I'm wondering what that has to do with your memories of your father.
Well, you know, it's has to do with the memory of my parents had a great love. You know, it was a great love, and tough act to follow, as one might say. You know, and he was stricken with multiple sclerosis when he was 38 years old. And so as I grew up and became stronger, I saw him getting weaker over the years. And he passed away in 1977, and I was alone with him when it happened. But he was an extraordinarily gentle man, and he was unbelievably strong in his gentleness, which is something I admire so much now looking back. And these are very, very tender love poems that he wrote to my mother, and so I wanted a setting for these poems that would be more private than public, if you understand my meaning.
Yeah,
And so that's why they're for viola and harp.
that's a wonderful explanation there. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the songs of love and loss, because you've mentioned some of your collaborators, but this is also with the Aransha Orchestra, and
Yes.
you mentioned Shahab Paranj a little bit earlier. He was the conductor of that. They're based in Los Angeles, right?
Yes, and this is a new orchestra that Shahab has just started. He is of all my students in the last decade, he is one of the real movers and shakers as former students go, because he's not only a composer, he's also conducting. He also is finishing his first year as a postdoctoral fellow at UCLA, teaching Persian music there. And he's also finishing his first opera. He's quite a force of nature. But this is the Iran Shower Orchestra is a kind of a malleable ensemble, and it's string based, but there are other players involved in it. And this piece is essentially a work for strings and harp.
I'm struck by the difference in your approach, your composing style for each of these sets of songs. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the Persian influence, especially in the first piece, because you hear that right away. It sounds very, very folksy, very Asian sounding, Western Asian.
Yeah. I only lived in Iran for a year as a child, which was the year 63 and part of 64, middle of 63 to the middle of 64. And my memories, I mean, I was 7 going on 8. It was right around the time that children begin to remember everything. And I remember quite a bit of it. And although I was born in the US and brought up as an American, the pervasive presence of my Iranian, of my Persian heritage was everywhere as I grew up. And at times I wasn't all that crazy about it, but I was also always a bit intrigued by it at the same time. The way I look at it now, I started coming back to an interest in it around 2001 when I wrote my second cello concerto for Yo-Yo Ma called Through the Ancient Valley, which the New York Philharmonic had commissioned. And then later on in 2009, I wrote a piece titled Remembering Neda about this woman, Neda Sultan, who had been killed in one of the Green Party uprisings in Iran, in Tehran, when Ahmadinejad was in power. And I started getting closer to Persian music actually through the great poetry, because everything really is accessible in Persian art through its poetry and through its great poets. Rumi, Hafez, and Khayyam, to name a few. But the way I look at my life now, I see myself as an American composer with a Middle Eastern memory, and this Persian DNA and this non-Western memory that's in my genes. I did my 23andMe test last year, and I found out I was 98.7% Persian and 1.3% Levantine from the area around Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and maybe some of Egypt. I have no European blood whatsoever.
I'm the opposite of you. I'm all European.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's that's what one would expect from people in this country, right? Yeah. So in a weird way, I mean, my blood is completely non-Western. So it's not surprising, notwithstanding the fact that I was only in Iran for a year, it's not surprising that this is something that comes through in spite of my environment being mostly, and not just in America, but I've spent an enormous amount of time over the last 40 years in Italy, which has been like a second home for me.
Yeah. I know that we have to wrap it up, but I wanted to ask you about your copyist. You have a little shout out to him in this recording. And
God.
I wonder.
He's amazing. But there are 2 of them. I have an engraver, a professional engraver who is also a former student of mine, but who is an amazing composer in his own right. His name is Anthony Constantino. He lives in Ohio now. He teaches at Bowling Green.
Yeah, I know him, actually.
Wonderful.
I know who you're talking about. Because Bowling Green is only just south of here, about 10 or 12 miles.
So you're very close. Yeah. Well, Anthony is he's a miracle. There are very few people like him in this country today. He's I think 29 going on 45. And the other one is the best proofreader I've ever worked with, who is also a former student of mine, Brandon Joe, who was the pianist for this production. He was the rehearsal pianist in every single rehearsal with the entire cast. But he also proofread every single page of both the piano vocal and the orchestral score.
Yeah, well, there's so much that goes into making the opera happen and into making this recording happen, I imagine. It's coming out. Go ahead.
As the saying goes, they say it takes a village, but in reality, it takes a very smart village.
Smart village. I like that. Richard Danielpour, thank you so much for joining us here on FM 91, being generous with your time. Best of luck with the new opera. I hope that it goes somewhere above and beyond what we've talked about, and also the CD that's coming out in June from Naxos American Classics. I'll link that when we post this online. But thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Really, really appreciate your time. Thank you.